Press this morning is reporting that President Trump is trying to minimize the differences. According to the article this morning, President Trump's Republican administration seems determined not to let differences on Iran overshadow effort to make headway on other difficult matters in the complicated relationship, ranging from trade to further Chinese cooperation to block exports of fentanyl precursors. We don't want this to be something that derails the broader relationship or the agreements that might come out of our meeting in Beijing, said the U.S. trade representatives. Do you think that the President Trump can avoid that? Can he avoid the elephant in the room on this war and make some headway on some of these other issues? What leverage does he have to I guess not coerce, that's the wrong word because it's not going to, but to influence China on doing something that's also beneficial to us?
He doesn't have influence to do much of anything right now. I think the Chinese know that our financial system is very fragile. They know that we desperately need access to their markets. They, on the other hand, have the rest of the world to trade with. They don't necessarily need us. That's something we've never completely understood, but that's always been a problem. They also know that this obsession with Iran is unhealthy strategically. You know, Churchill obsessed over the destruction of Germany during the Second World War. He obsessed over it to the point where he was willing to sacrifice British national power for the prestige of a Pyrrhic victory over Germany. I think that's what's happening right now. We're sacrificing everything for the sake of a Pyrrhic Israeli victory over Iran. It's not going to happen. We can't do to Iran what we and the Soviet Union and the British Empire were able to do to Japan and Germany. We can't do it. We don't have the power. Things have changed. China is enormously powerful. So if he wants to get anywhere with China, first of all, he's got to demilitarize his relations with China, and I would argue with the rest of Asia. Get out of this business of trying to position forces in other people's countries that ring China. We've already got batteries of theater ballistic missiles sitting on the northern island of Luzon in the Philippines to threaten China. Who are we kidding? The Chinese don't notice that? Of course they notice it. It's ridiculous. We need to stop that. We also need to treat the Chinese as equals. Do you remember what happened when the Biden administration sent a delegation up to Anchorage to meet with the Chinese foreign minister and Tony Blinken? Well, the Chinese laughed them out of the room. It was ridiculous. It was a joke. We were embarrassed. It's going to be worse this time. We've got to stop this. This hubris has got to end. Unfortunately, this administration has built its entire program on the foundation of hubris and arrogance. We don't have, in Donald Trump's words, the cards. That's the problem.
That is the problem again, and we just haven't come to grips with that because I think too many that are in the administration, especially up at this level, the senior policymakers still think it's 1992, where we won the Cold War, the USSR disintegrated, Warsaw Pact disintegrated, China was still a third world country, and a peasant army, etc. And I don't think they ever left that. So they're still acting like that's still the case, but it's profoundly changed since then. And I hope we figure that out sooner rather than later. Let me ask you another question, though, Doug, on something I know that you've been paying some attention to, because there are those who say, you know what, forget about what Macgregor said there. Forget about, trying to work with them. They're our enemy and they're working against us. In fact, they're even sabotaging us from within. This Los Angeles Times here, this Arcadia mayor is accused of being a Chinese foreign agent. They say, yes, see, stuff like this is why we need to work harder against them. What do you say to this?
Well, I looked at the remarks that she made and her behavior. Obviously, I'm somebody who is very critical of what I call hybrid identity. I don't like people that say, well, I'm something else and then I'm an American. Either you're an American or you're not. So as a general rule, I'm unenthusiastic about all of that. But I would say that whatever she's accused of doing, which doesn't look like very much, it shrinks to insignificance next to what we've seen the Israel lobby engage in and the large numbers of dual citizens, people that are American citizens and also have Israeli citizenship. We've said nothing about it. We've done nothing about it. We've treated it as though, well, that's fine. There's no problem there. We're brothers under the skin. Well, we're not. We don't share the same interests. We don't share the same interests with Israel any more than we share exactly the same interests with China. But you want people running your government who are preeminently, first and foremost, Americans. If I could, I'd pass a law that prohibits anyone who is a dual citizen of any other country from serving in federal office, appointed or elected, or for that matter, in the United States Armed Forces. Either you are an American or you aren't. That's it. End of discussion.
Yeah, I'm all for that. For just hypothetically speaking, like say some member of U.S. Congress would come onto the floor in the military uniform of another country. I don't know, that kind of rubs me the wrong way, as obviously has happened with this Israeli guy. Staying in Asia, though, because there's more things going on than just the U.S. China relationship here, and we talked about this, I think, 2 weeks ago when you were on. It seems to be gaining some more energy. Korea pushes for operational controlled transfer as U.S. presses for expanded alliance role. What's their latest on this situation?
Well, most Americans are unaware of this. They don't understand that since the 1950s, we have retained not just a small force on the peninsula, arguably as quote unquote a tripwire against the possibility that the North Koreans might attack, but also because we retain operational control of all the forces on the peninsula. That includes the few forces we have, as well as the Korean Air Force, Army, and Navy. Well, this is ridiculous. From the Korean standpoint, they've been arguing about this for over 20 years. Until the Korean government in Seoul controls all the forces on the ground in South Korea, they're not a sovereign state. They're not treated seriously by anybody in Asia. People in Asia say, oh, well, Korea is just a vassal state of the greater U.S. military empire. In other words, they're a military colony for the U.S. Armed Forces. This needs to go away. It's 20, 25 years overdue. But there are problems. We see ourselves as in a conflict with China. Therefore, we are trying to drag everyone we can find everywhere into the conflict with us. We're trying to drag the Japanese, the Koreans. We've tried to drag the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese have said very bluntly, we don't particularly like the Chinese, but we're not interested in going to war with China. Forget it. The same thing, by the way, is true in Taiwan. The Taiwanese population doesn't want a war with China. Taiwan's going to end up voting itself back into China over time. That'll be settled without any interference by us. Korea doesn't want a war on the peninsula. They know that North Korea is a basket case. It's like looking at a crowd of homeless people and that are starving on the streets, and one of them has a giant grenade and says, if you come near us, I'm pulling the grenade pin. That's North Korea. Koreans want a united Korean peninsula. We were worried back in the 60s and the 70s that the Korean army would take the future into its own hands, that they would say, the hell with this, we're reuniting the peninsula. So our force was there to stop a war, regardless of whether the South or the North started it. Today, the potential for a real war on that peninsula is at the lowest it's ever been in its history. The Chinese will not tolerate a war in Northeast Asia. They have told the North Koreans in no uncertain terms, if you try to start something, you are on your own. As far as we're concerned, the Americans or anybody else can crush you. We will do nothing for you. However, if you are credibly attacked, yes, we will provide support. We will come to your aid. So Kim in North Korea has always known he can't start anything without losing everything. And finally, if you're Xi right now and you look at South Korea and North Korea, you say, look at South Korea. We're doing a land office business with South Korea. It's productive. It's leading the world in any number of different sectors. It's probably almost as important as Taiwan in microcircuitry and computer science. They want to do business with South Korea, and privately, they'd like to make a choice. they'd like South Korea to ultimately take over North Korea because they would feel safer with Seoul in charge. The problem is that's an impossibility right now because we are there. And as long as we are on the peninsula, the Chinese have made it abundantly clear there will be no reunification. There will be no eternal peace in Northeast Asia. Forget it. It's not going to happen because you are sponsoring a U.S. military platform from which they can project power against us. By the way, the Japanese are watching all of this, as well as the Koreans, and they're watching what's happened in the Gulf. And they're concluding, these Americans really can't help protect us.
Yeah.
Iran has demonstrated that very conclusively. So in the Japanese parliament, in the House of Deputies in Korea, people are saying, do we really need these Americans? And privately, they're concluding, no. Now, that doesn't mean they don't want to do business with us. This is the thing that we don't understand, because people like Robert Kagan and others have tried to confuse people by saying, if we're not interested in being involved in someone else's war, if we're not interested in meddling in the affairs of other peoples and other countries and other nations, we're isolationists. No, we're not isolationists. The business of America really is business. And we should be doing business with everybody.
Yes.
But we treat certain categories for various reasons as permanent enemies. We should get out of this business of treating the world as consisting of permanent enemies and look at all of these various nations to one degree or another as potential strategic partners, what we call in legal terms, limited liability partners, instead of permanent allies, which really means in our parlance to people like Donald Trump or Robert Kagan, permanent vassal states. Korea is tired of being a vassal state. It wants to be sovereign and independent. We should welcome that. But that's not what we're dealing with in Washington. We're dealing with people that don't see it that way.
Yeah, and it's so hard to break out of these decades of that's just how we do things, that it's hard to break that out. I think it's going to end up breaking itself out because of our
exactly right. You're exactly right. We're, instead of leaving and people waving goodbye and saying, well, we want to do business with you, we want to work with you in the future, we're going to get a very different reaction when we finally go, because we're going to be kicked out. And it doesn't help when someone like Mr. Hegseth is trying to recruit the Koreans to join a war against Iran. Why would they ever want to be involved? Well, they need to help shoulder the burden. It's back to this, everyone owes us something.
Yeah.
That's just not true.
And everybody is going to do what's in their national interest. They're not going to do the so-called OTIS when it costs them something.
And George Washington said it best. And he said this repeatedly to many, many people in Washington in his time who did not understand it. He said, no nation state can be expected to move beyond the limits of its own interests. We have to accept that.
Yeah.
Get out of this be allied with us forever on our terms so that you can suffer with us in the pointless wars we start.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's true whether we accept it or not, and that's how they're going to do, and eventually that's going to probably be our Achilles heel. Listen, in the last few minutes we have here, Doug, speaking of Secretary Hegseth, there's one other thing he said this morning at this hearing I'd like your viewpoint on, because it has to do with internal Pentagon dynamics and how he wants to reform how the Pentagon operates from within. And of course, nobody in our country, and this is a literal statement, has spent more time and written more books on how to reform and reorganize the Department of Defense and turn it into something that's actually useful to our country, et cetera. So I'd like your view on what he said this morning.
We have flipped the Pentagon acquisition process from a bureaucratic model to a business model, decisively moving from an acquisition environment paralyzed by bureaucratic red tape into an outcomes-driven organization focused on delivering the most for taxpayer dollars. And Mr. Chairman, you're right, it's a war of attrition against the Pentagon bureaucracy every single day, and we intend to win it.
Now, that was a lot of bumper stickers there. Was there any substance behind it?
I'd have to look at the details, but I would say a couple of things that everybody listening needs to keep in mind. If you're Mitch McConnell, who is one of the biggest defense whores on the Hill, and there are many, many other, he's by no means the Lone Ranger. Congress is always interested in finding ways to ship more money into the Department of Defense than the Department of Defense can possibly use or employ effectively. Now, think about that. They always want to ship more money over there. Why? Well, first of all, Congress will tell you that their principal job is to spend money. They're spending money in various ways designed to do what? Keep them in office and enrich them, directly or indirectly. So what he's saying to somebody like Mitchell is, I'm fixing this so that all those troublesome bureaucrats that raise questions about whether or not the weapon system we want really works are going to shut up and color, and we're going to get those weapons to the troops that they need. Reminds me of some work years ago that I did along with some partners for the Secretary of the Navy. And one of the things that we discovered from the fleet at sea was people come out here and they ask us, what do you need? And we tell them what we really need are shotguns. And then we don't hear anything from 3 or 4 years, maybe 5 years. And the same people come back and hand us laser pistols and they don't work. That's the problem. The whole process of establishing requirements needs to be radically revised and changed. We have programs running for years based on requirements that were developed 10, 15, 20 years ago. And in many cases, those requirements no longer apply. So on the one hand, if what he is saying has real value, yes, I can't argue with anything he said. But my suspicion is that's not what's happening. My suspicion is we're making it easier to get to money that the generals, the admirals, as well as the industrial leaders want desperately for their own purposes. And you see, we've reached a point now, this should be very obvious to everybody who's watching what's happening in the Persian Gulf. It should have been obvious to everybody who is watching what's happening in eastern Ukraine, that we're not getting the right things because we don't have the right organizations, we don't have the right designs, and in many cases, we don't have the right people in charge. All of that is far more important than what he's discussing right now, which is legitimate, but it's not as important as those things I just mentioned up front.
Yeah, and indeed, that's one of the reasons why we keep having you back on, because you've been saying this literally for decades. 1997's Breaking the Phalanx was the first of many books that followed. So the blueprints are out there if anybody's willing to actually follow them or put you in charge. I'll just throw that out there for the next
The other thing, Dan, before you leave, is just to make one point. There are lots of good people in the Department of Defense. There's a lot of talent tied up in the armed forces. The problem is the nature of the bureaucratic structure is not really conducive to their emergence. They don't end up in a position of authority. If you want to change something, the biggest mistake you can make if you go to Congress is tell them you're going to change something. No one there wants to change anything because for them it's all about the money, and no one wants to disrupt the flow of money. That's the problem. So I don't want to sound overly critical of the people in and out of uniform in the Department of Defense as a whole, because I've seen lots of good people do good things. The larger problem is what I referred to at the end. Structure, design, organization, leadership, those things, those are monumental tasks for anybody in the future.
In my opinion, Col Douglas Macgregor's statement shows that the Trump administration understood it could not allow the conflict with Iran to completely damage its strategic relationship with China. In a time of global economic instability, Washington still needed Beijing on trade, supply chains, and broader geopolitical interests. This also reflects the reality that although the U.S. and China are fierce rivals, both sides are still forced to maintain dialogue and cooperation in certain critical areas. Iran is only one part of a much larger global power struggle. Personally, I believe separating the Iran issue from U.S. China relations was a pragmatic move, because turning every disagreement into total confrontation would have serious economic and political consequences for the entire world. What do you think about Douglas Macgregor's assessment?
Thank you, boss.